I was born for the storm, and a calm does not suit me. What's up, everybody? It's Lit Book Reviews, the
Mm,
podcast where we discuss all things books. I'm Spider-Man. With me, as always, is Iron Man.
mm.
Here to
Who
do
was that?
yet
Me?
another one. Hmm?
Who was that?
Iron Man?
Are you No, that was an Iron Man quote.
Oh,
Was
no, no,
that?
no.
Oh,
That was an Andrew Jackson quote.
oh, okay.
That was our
Sounded
boy
like
Andrew Jackson.
they are very similar in ways.
Iron Man and Andrew Jackson? Yeah, I mean, basically the same person. So yeah, today we are discussing a biography, a semi-biography on the man, Andrew Jackson. This is American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. This was written by John Meacham. It's got a 3.86 out of 5 stars on Goodreads with 55,000 ratings. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. Came out in 2008. We're going to discuss it today. John Meacham is actually one of my favorite authors. He's a really well known historian, written several books that I very much enjoy. Amongst them are The Soul of America. That's the first one that I read by him. Kind of just discusses the American presidency. He's really a presidential historian. That's mostly what he writes about. So it makes sense that he has a book kind of devoted to that. He's also got The Art of Power, biography on Thomas Jefferson. He's got a great book, And There Was Light, one on Abraham Lincoln. He's got a book. What's the other ones? He's
You've
got
read both
one
of those,
on.
right?
I have. I've read both of those ones, and I've read another. But of course, the computer's not
Goodreads.
working while I'm trying to pull everything up because, of course, I'm just not ready at all times. But he's written one on John Lewis called "His Truth Is Marching On." I've yet to get to that one. And he's written a few others, but world-renowned historian, very well known. And again, this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. So I love John Meacham. I went into this with super high hopes, and it delivered for the most part. There were things we'll discuss throughout the book that I guess I didn't love as much. Oh, and Franklin and Winston, duh, by John Meacham.
Oh, I read
Great
that.
book.
I don't know
Yeah,
why
you
I
read.
was.
We
Yeah,
both
forgot
read that. Another great book about Churchill and FDR. And he's got some others that I own that I haven't got to yet. But again, John Meacham is great. But this one specifically, again, Andrew Jackson. What'd you rate this one, man?
I rated it a 4 stars. I think I rated it a hard 4.0 out of 5 because my ratings. I'll try and give more of a specific rating. I know we don't always do the best about being consistent on what those even mean,
Yeah, yeah,
but
we're not good at that.
yeah, I gave it a
Let's go
four.
with
I,
our
I
gut.
really liked it a lot, but like I'm sure we'll get into, I wasn't aware that this was only about his presidency. And
Right.
again, I'm sure once we figure out your rating, we can kind of talk about why it wasn't a 5.
Yeah, for
The
sure. I
writing was
also
great.
gave it a 4. Yeah, writing's amazing. I mean, John Meacham always delivers. But I did give this one a 4. It's actually I'd have to really think about it, but it's lower on the list for all the ones I've read of his, but that's only because his books are just consistently amazing.
Yeah,
And I think all his other books I've read, I've given 5 stars. I'm pretty sure. But we'll get into why it's still an amazing book. I would recommend this to anyone who wants to learn about Jackson. But yes, it is important to note this isn't a proper, strictly a biography. It is, for the most part, just talking about his presidency. He does go back and give you some context and talk about his earlier life, but it is mostly about the presidency. So
yeah.
we both gave it 4 stars over here out of 5. It's a 3.86, so that's really not an amazing rating. It's not bad at all, but usually when it's
Yeah,
below
for good.
4, I feel like,
Yeah,
you're unsure of how good it's going to be. But
yeah.
again, Meacham always delivers. And a lot of the books I've read by him are very recent works of his, so I'm sure he's grown as an author, but it's still a great book.
Mhm.
What else would you say just about the rating,
So I
Iron Man?
said I'll just read my review. Which, dude, I've done a good job. I'm proud of myself, man. I've rated every book that I've read for a while, and it's been I've been doing it longer than I thought. And
Reviewed? Yeah.
so, as far as typing it or writing an actual review on Goodreads, just which helps me because it's so easy to read a book and then you're like, what did I mean by that 4 stars? But anyway, I have reading this book has helped me shape a better understanding of who Andrew Jackson truly was, deeply flawed, but the epitome of the American dream, an orphan who rose to presidency in an age of prestige, a man who missed the mark in bringing American freedom to all its inhabitants, but fought fiercely to preserve the Union that would. A man of the time indeed, but a man who truly fought for the common man when politics was exclusive. This book only looks at Jackson's life during his presidency and shortly after, I understand. This was the scope of Meacham's book, but the focus on Margaret Eaton's impact wore on me. I wanted more of Jackson that won New Orleans and invaded Florida. That's the only knock on this book for me, which again is more personal than lack of good writing. Women play a major role in Jackson's presidency through Meacham's interpretation, positively and negatively so. That being said, a majority of this book has the feel of a midday soap opera. Washington drama was clearly important in its impact, but unfortunately, it's not the product of my desires. Overall, solid book that really helps characterize the complicated figure Jackson was, undoubtedly one of the greatest presidents of our nation. So,
Pretty solid review.
dude, I've been trying to
I
go
got to
in.
give it to you.
Appreciate it.
It's pretty solid.
What are your thoughts? Yeah, I know you have more to pull from Meacham wise.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as my rating and review, the writing is still amazing. The writing doesn't miss here. I think for me, the main thing, honestly, when I think of why did it lose a star, it really is to me, a bit overdone inclusion of all of the Margaret Eaton, Emily Donaldson,
Yeah.
John Calhoun, everybody involved in the Petticoat Affair, as it were. Now, historically, and in within Jackson's presidency, in the context of his presidency and his cabinet, it is important historically. But especially with how elite of a writer Meacham is, I did feel like he could have still presented that information in a compelling manner that got the point across without it taking up so much of the book. I mean, looking back, it feels like 60% of this book is
Oh,
covering those
yeah.
details, which is kind of wild. And I don't if it wasn't Meacham writing it, if it was an author that doesn't write as well as him, it probably would have been a 3-star book for me just because of that. Now,
Yeah.
again, John Meacham for sure knows more than I do about Andrew
Yeah.
Jackson and the presidency and American history. So if he tells me that it's so important that it needs to be 60% of this book, I believe him. If he's telling
Yeah.
me that the effects of the Petticoat Affair were more impactful than just about everything else in Jackson's presidency, then okay, I'm here for it. I believe you. But it's just like you said in your review, like you were just saying, it just is very melodramatic. And Meacham even talks about that. So it's not a flaw in Meacham's writing or the book. He is presenting what
What
happened
happened?
and
Yeah.
what seems to have been a huge part of Jackson's life and presidency. So I can't knock him, can't knock the author, but part of my rating at least is always going to be on the experience I had while reading it. And it did get to a point where I was having like Shalon-esque feelings where I was like, dude, are we
Yeah.
really talking about Margaret Eaton again? Like, I
It's
got
not
it.
what you
Nobody
think,
likes
though,
her.
especially because the book is titled American Lion. And then what I did know of Jackson beforehand, I'm like, all right, he's about to do some reckless stuff, which not that he
Right.
doesn't in this book, but you think that that's going to be a majority of it, which I mean,
Right.
I really don't think you're over exaggerating. I think especially Emily Donaldson, her impact clearly was massive, which again, we're not disputing the facts of how impactful she was, but it's just from what
Yeah,
I've
she
heard
clearly
about
was.
Jackson, this just wasn't what I expected to be a major plot point. Um, so again, it helps you get a better picture of who he really was. But it's one
Yeah,
of
and
those.
just
It's not Meacham's fault that's who he really was, but it's just kind of like, oh, okay,
yeah, and just so and we're gonna get continually better at this, hopefully, especially in this video. But there is always going to be a little bit of jumping around. But for those of you that don't know much about Jackson at all and haven't read this book, just so you have some context, what the Petticoat Affair is essentially Margaret Eaton was a very promiscuous woman. Okay, that's basically what you need to know. She got around a lot, which back then was a much bigger deal than it is now, as everyone knows. Um, Someone who is close to Jackson and ended up being in his presidential cabinet ends up marrying her. And at the time, it was, Jackson is seen as a president who kind of ended this, but in America leading up to Jackson, it was a very aristocratic culture. So when someone new came into town, say a new cabinet member in Jackson's presidency, and his family are new or whatever, they moved into their house, if someone visits you, you're supposed to visit them back. If I go to Andrew's house, he's supposed to come back to me. It's a sign of being accepted in the community. It's like the thing you do. It's just all
Yeah.
about social cues and social rules, which is super lame to modern people, which is part of why this wasn't super enjoyable. They were all just kind of losers back then, the culture. So it was really important whether or not you went back to someone's house, but it is what it is. It's how things were. And so because people didn't like this woman because she was promiscuous, they shunned her in society. And it results in all kinds of crazy stuff in Jackson's presidency because he is very good friends with Major Eaton, who ends up marrying Margaret
Yeah.
Eaton. So for those of you who don't know, that's what the Petticoat Affair revolves around, is a promiscuous woman who a lot of the ladies of society in Washington, D.C. did not like and shunned, who Jackson was friends with, so it caused a bunch of drama. I mean, it seems that Meacham makes the point that it resulted in Van Buren being the 8th president of the United States. In a lot of ways, it's because of this scandal, Petticoat Affair, and how certain people responded to it, resulted in cabinet changes and in personnel, and eventually the 8th president of the United States. So that's why it's in the book and why it's important. And I hope that people don't hear this and think, well, that book's not for me, because it really is. Like, if you don't know this already, that's not something Andrew and I would typically be into reading, a melodramatic societal, drama between women
Yeah.
of revolutionary Washington, D.C. So, but Meacham is an amazing writer, so it's still not bad. It's still a great book. I just think the other 40% of the book was what I was looking for and was more enjoyable. So it's 4 out of 5. Most writers would get a 3-star for that, but Meacham's a god. So
Yeah.
I feel like does that pretty much explain your rating and reasons for,
Yeah, I think
a
again, yeah, I
4-star?
mean it's an accurate depiction clearly I mean, I'm going to trust that it's an accurate depiction of what happened with Jackson. Um and yeah, it gives you an insight on things that on the cover. I think you said it well, like don't if you're someone who's interested in Jackson, I mean you should read this because it's
For
what
sure.
really happens, especially if you care about his presidency, which just to kind of talk about I guess like the overall like what actually happens in this book like is it's more of how he changes the presidency
Hmm.
forever, how he keeps the union together, how he changes politics in America forever. Like those things
Hmm.
are really the main focus. It's just to get there, you do have to understand the context of the time, which is what Meacham does. And so it's
Hmm.
important. You do need to know it, even though it's not what we as guys would like. But it may end up having a wider
Sure.
audience, to be honest, because I'm sure some people would find that interesting. It's just not what I want. I want to
Yeah.
watch. I do. I just want to watch him fight the Seminoles in Florida when John Quincy Adams tells him. Not that he didn't tell him not to, but you know what I mean. Where he's like,
Yeah.
I just want to see that. I want to see that side of Jackson, which again you get a little bit of. So it's not that you don't, but
Right.
I just
Right.
wasn't expecting what happened. But as far as who you thought Jackson was before, did this book change who you thought he was? I feel like that's a loaded
Yeah, for
question.
sure. I mean, it definitely informed more than anything, but did change slightly in some degrees, just because my I've never read anything specifically about Jackson and haven't really read
Yeah.
a ton at all in his era. That's why I've kind of been going through the presidents with biographies, and we're just now at number 7, which is crazy. I've been taking it slow, but yeah, I had this image of Jackson as, I mean, being an American lion, like, but in the most really just uneducated sense. I just didn't know, and I thought, so the main thing, and we'll get into more of the details later, but the main thing that I perceived incorrectly was that during the nullification crisis with South Carolina, I thought Andrew Jackson rode at the head of a column of troops and went to South Carolina and like
Yeah.
shed blood. Maybe
Forcefully,
not
yeah.
shed
All that
blood, but
stuff.
I thought there was a movement of military force with
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson. I don't know why. That was a complete, misconception. I had never looked into it to verify it or deny it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't something I ever would have spoken about, been like, "Oh yeah, he did that." But for some reason in the back of my head, I thought, I think he like actually took troops over there, but I was
What
wrong. And
it adds
that's
up with his kinda energy towards Native Americans, which we'll get into later too, where even
yes.
though it's not him that forcefully does it, he's very adamant about it. So, I mean, I could see where, yeah, I mean, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
the little you know and hear, because I was the same way. I thought, if you look at super liberal lists, it's like, oh, he's one of the worst presidents we've ever had. And then like after this book, like
Mm,
I do genuinely think, again, with the little I know about the presidents that I know about, like I could see where people would put him as one of the best presidents of all time. Again, by acknowledging that he was extremely flawed. So it's not like, oh,
sure. Yeah.
everything. But I mean, too many great presidents referred to him, which again we'll get into
Oh
later. So
yeah.
it's like
So many.
the impacts that, if you're interested to learn about, that we'll talk about here in a second, he just has some huge impacts that I didn't necessarily realize. Like I knew he
Yeah.
was kind of the common man's president, but I didn't realize to the extent that it was. Like it's more real than I thought of. And
Yeah. It's like
so,
a night and day. Yeah.
and to
Change.
me, it seems to be a very pivotal point in American history to where America could have gone a different way and it doesn't.
Mm,
And
yeah.
I think looking back again, there's certain things where it's like, man, I wish he didn't do that. But he's a man of his time. But at the same time, he made choices that a lot of other people weren't going to make. And again, I just think he shifts America in a direction that it needed to go. Like, and
Yeah.
you know, anyway. So I mean, I was happily pleased to kind of get that information dump of like, okay, now I feel like I could say something about Jackson and feel way more confident about it.
For
You know,
sure. Yeah, I would completely agree. And the only other thing I really knew about was a connection between him and Native Americans, and
yeah.
that he does not have a great record as far as modern audiences are concerned. But
It's
again, a
not as
man of the
bad as I
times.
thought it was, though. I'm not gonna justify anything, but I thought he was gonna be a worse person, and
Yeah.
he really wasn't. He's not as bad of a person as people I think want him to be. That like who don't really want to dig deep and
Well,
read a hundred
definitely
page
not
book
when
on
you.
him. You know?
Yeah, but definitely he's definitely not as bad as some people want to make him out to be when you consider the times. I
Yeah.
mean, at some point we have to just say, yeah, the vast majority of people, as far as we were concerned, were horrible. Sure.
Uh,
But if we're going to look at at the times and have an understanding of who he was, because you can't think about someone from,
yeah.
a century or two ago in the context of anything today, really, at all. It's just
No.
not really fair to you or to history to try and picture it that way, because you're just not going to have an understanding of how these things played out. But yeah, it definitely, again, I didn't know much about him, so it definitely informed me a lot and kind of changed my perspective, because we'll get into this more, but frankly, Meacham makes an argument that Jackson was much less volatile in his presidential years than is sometimes made out to be. Like he
Yeah.
refrains from being from letting that side of him out, if you will, in presidential moments where he has to make big decisions. So, yeah, it was very eye opening, and it's cool to just understand why those like presidents, like even FDR, as recently as FDR, and I'm sure other modern presidents have mentioned them, but I think JFK did as well. Like all these huge presidents that we kind of more familiarized with in modernity referred to him as one of the greats.
Yeah.
They would
Dude, and I
refer
don't
to
know about
Washington
you,
and Jackson as the greats.
but I like scarily see a lot of similarities to like where we're at in today's time. And I don't,
Yeah,
not that this is a modern political podcast, but you know, we are living in like real history times, and it does feel like
yeah,
we're almost in the same age of like what was going on in Jackson's time, where regardless if you agree with what who Trump is and his things, I mean, it seems like a majority of the US population does. Maybe not the mainstream media, but that's what it kind of felt like maybe happened for Jackson. He was kind of the original almost. I mean, he wasn't a businessman, but you know what I mean? Like I just feel like I see a lot of connections to where
yeah.
populism instead of this it's tough because it's like instead of elitism when like Trump was a billionaire before, but like you know what I mean? It's like a
Hmm.
man of the people. I'm going to do what the people want instead of what big
Yeah.
business wants or big government wants. And so
Yeah, I
it's
mean, it's
just
impossible to
interesting.
have any. Yeah, like to your point, it's impossible to have true parallels. Obviously, there's going to be differences, but there are definitely parallels to be examined here. And I think, again, not to get deep in today's politics, but the question of the power of the presidency is definitely something that is pertinent in modern
Yeah,
times. And
true.
that is, I mean, that's what Jackson is known for, is expanding and defining the power of the
Yeah,
presidency for future administrations. So, yeah, you're always going to find some parallels, but I would agree with you. Some of them feel like towards uncanny, and we don't mean that in a good or bad way. That's just
no, yeah,
there are parallels to be noted here. So yeah, it's a very good book. I think we both highly recommend you check this out if you're interested in this era or in Jackson himself. Yeah, I mean, what else is there to say at the top here? You want to get into some deets?
Yeah. So yeah, if you're interested in just learning more about him and what we learned, we're just going to outline um just kind of some of his major events that Meacham shows, and then we'll go over kind of some big picture themes that we think Meacham's trying to say. Um so yeah, if you're interested in just learning more, we're about to get on into that.
We're about to tell you what we thought we learned. Let's see if we get it right. So, I mean, to start from the beginning, again, this book does not cover Jackson's entire life. It definitely gives you
It's a
context where
shame.
you need it. But yeah, so a lot of the stuff that Jackson is well known for, such as his actions in Florida, the Battle of New
New
Orleans,
Orleans, yeah.
all that stuff, it's talked about, but it's not covered in detail in this book. So this isn't really, if you're looking for a strict biography, birth to death, this really isn't the best book, but it's more of a succinct look at the big ticket items and, of course, his presidency. So, but to go back to the start, just to give you some context, because we're going to be talking a lot about how Jackson was so different from his six predecessors, the first six
Yeah.
presidents. He was the end of the aristocrat presidency, and was not aligned with that culture at all. So I have a note, a kind of a thick note that I'm just going to read as I wrote it when reading the early chapters of the book. So Jackson's early life was marred by tragedy. His father died just before he was born. One brother died early in the Revolutionary War. And then just before the end of the war, he and his other brother were captured by the British, during which his brother was injured. And that injury later led to his death right before they got home. So his other brother died. Not long after that, his mother leaves for Charleston to tend to the wounded cousins, where she would also die. Jackson's 14 years old at the time. And then, I mean, obviously, that's a terrible childhood. 14 years old, and everybody he knows is gone. Everybody close
Yeah.
to him is gone, essentially. And then that tragedy follows him through life. And right before he's already the president elect, but right before he becomes president of the United States, his wife Rachel dies. So to kind of give you some context of who Jackson is, I mean, this is a dude who dealt with a lot of loss. Now, it wasn't uncommon in this era for all of your family to
Yeah.
die. That happened a lot, but it certainly still had a tragic effect on anyone who experienced that. So I just
He
think
was
that's
north.
really interesting. Um, and I definitely at some point uh, in the next years, I'm going to have to read a full biography on him so
Yeah.
I can get more of the details of those early life occurrences. But John Meacham makes the point that this guy came from tragedy, and
Poverty.
definitely had to, yeah, impoverished, had to pick himself up by his bootstraps type shit. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I just thought that was really interesting.
One of the
Anything
biggest
else?
moments, yeah, one of the biggest moments to piggyback off what you said that like I'll forever remember is and I may not characterize this perfectly right, but it's a moment that I'm not sure where it's documented. Maybe it was Jackson or Jackson told somebody, but I guess there were some British officers that came in and tried to make him polish their boots when he was a kid.
Mm,
This during
right.
Revolutionary War, and he like demands to be treated as a prisoner of war respectfully or whatever. And then I think that's when his brother gets injured, the one who
Yeah,
dies on the
I
return ride
believe so.
home. And I think he gets I mean, not he gets not beaten, but I'm sure he gets punched or something. But just to have that, like, I don't know, it's just to think about, especially where his timeline aligns, like to be so personally involved in an event of the Revolutionary War at such a young age, to me
Yeah,
is like, I don't want to say it's cool because it's tough, but it's like that's such a cool like story of
yeah. I mean, it's just
like a
it's
moment for
legendary.
Jackson, because you can tell like it's a spark of no, like I'm not gonna. It's kind of one of the first moments you kind of that Meacham at least points out to like, no, he's not gonna be pushed around. Like
Yeah,
he's gonna say no to stuff. He's gonna stand up for himself, and then you can kind of tell it maybe kind of builds character, but then also to build off that too, which is another crazy like thing to think about being so young and seeing stuff. But him and his mom tending to all the wounded and how he couldn't go fight because he wasn't technically old enough, but how he wanted to. So instead, he's like at the church, just helping his mom take care of all these people that are dying that have just now fought
Right.
for America's freedom. So to be there, like, I mean, just to literally be living history like that, it's, I mean, obviously looking back, it probably feels more um impactful, but like, I mean, he was there, like he was there and experienced it in a way that is so different than maybe like John Quincy Adams, who maybe
Right.
saw more of the political side of it, but like he was boots on the ground, like saw what was actually happening in some small town in South Carolina.
Yeah,
And
again, he saw it from the perspective of the common man. That's
yeah,
kind of the theme. Like he was just a person. He was not born into the aristocracy. They had no money. He was just a regular dude, a young kid actually, experiencing absolute tragedy during
yeah,
the Revolutionary War. Um, so yeah, other than that, as far as like his younger days, from what we understand, he grew up immersed in church and prayer and scripture and all that kind of stuff, and just a deep love for country. That's kind of the impression I got from Meacham as far as him being young. And then that latter part obviously shows in his experience during the Revolutionary War with when he's captured.
yeah. He
So,
tries to tie into how he relates his country because he doesn't have family that that country kind of replaces that, and so he sees country as family. And I guess
right.
later on we'll see with like
Yeah. I'm glad
nullification
you said
crisis
that.
where he like
That's an important
so
thing to him.
personally feels like, hey, I got to keep the family together, meaning I got to keep the country together, and don't disrespect America. Like he had a lot of national pride, not which I mean, dude is so interesting. Which again, I'm sure we'll get into too, but to think about like as far as America goes, like to have national pride instead of like, no, I'm South Carolinian, I'm Georgian, like no, I'm
Mm,
American. That's
right.
he's one of the first I feel like that really you can kind of see that because it's funny to think that he was born in South Carolina and like has every reason to kind of align with someone like Calhoun.
Right.
So anyway, it's interesting that he kind of gets out of there, goes to Tennessee, and is not like an identity is formed, but it's not the identity that like I guess that's what makes him so different. Like it's weird that he doesn't align with all these other guys like that more. I mean,
Right.
there's parts of him that do with like him not wanting to give up slavery and whatnot, but
Right.
it's just interesting that he has such a strong American identity. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if he had been around for the Civil War, he would have been one of the few, I believe, one of the few slave owner from the South, prominent men who would have still fought for the Union and fought against his own state. Maybe not, but from everything he did in his life, it does seem
yeah,
like he probably would have. Maybe when the question of actually abolishing slavery came up, it would have been different. And that kind of goes into one of the other things just contextually before we get into what this book covers, which is the presidency, that you need to know about Jackson. He was an unapologetic slave owner his entire life. And when it came up later in his life, he was still that way. He was that way through and through. And again, when we're talking about these people, obviously, man of the times, there were certainly people, even in his own life, that he knew very well, like John Quincy Adams, after his presidency when he was an old man, who were abolitionists and wanted slavery to be abolished. But obviously, it doesn't happen for a bit, for another 30 years after Jackson's presidency. But that's definitely something to know. I mean, man of the times, definitely owned slaves. Um, and he obviously, again, had all the conflict with Native Americans. He didn't give a rat's ass about them either. He did, in a lot of his decisions, claim that he was thinking in their best interests as well as Americans, but obviously he was unapologetic about the fact that Americans did come first. And just something really interesting that I made a note about is that after a battle where they slaughtered a bunch of Indians, Jackson sees this little Native American boy whose family has been killed, and he decides to adopt him. Um, and at first it sounds like, oh, that's kind of that's kind of sweet or whatever. Like he didn't want to kill the kid, but then I didn't write down what he said in the actual letter, but he essentially adopted this kid so that his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., would have a playmate. That's like the word he uses, is he wanted him to have a playmate. So yeah, I mean, he didn't, he saved his life or whatever, I guess. But it's just funny, like even something like that that can seem altruistic from a distance, like
yeah,
he was just like, I just want my kid to have somebody to play with when he's at home.
yeah. It's tough though, dude, because I think I came into this book like wanting to see like I agree, like he's flawed, but at the same time, like I mean, obviously the slavery thing is tough. Like I mean, there's no like really defending that. but at the same time, I don't think he like hated black people. Like, I mean, it's not one of those things, and I don't think he hated Native Americans. I don't think he's not one of those people where it's like you point to someone like Hitler or Stalin, and it's like, why did they do like, there's just levels to it, and he wasn't even close to that level
Sure.
because when you think about the savagery that he himself experienced, like as far as natives, like Indians, I can't remember what fort it is, but I know he is a part of a group. I guess that I don't know if they show up, but I think it was further south, maybe in Mississippi, and it's like 250 people that are like brutally like
Yeah, they were
brutally
mutilated.
murdered
Yeah.
by and it's women, children, and like
Yeah, and that
they're
was super
talking.
common.
He
Yeah,
described like
yeah.
where they like not didn't just kill them, like they like you said they mutilated the bodies and did
Mhm.
crazy stuff. So I mean,
Yeah, chopped
imagine
off
like
genitalia and shoved it down people's throats, like,
yeah, and
horrible stuff, mutilated them.
you roll up to a fort and you see that firsthand. It's I mean, it would be tough not to just
Oh, yeah, I
you know
mean,
what I mean? So it's
that's all
like as
throughout,
far
yeah,
as
the that's a lot in that Sherman and Geronimo book that I read, like,
yeah,
when you look at the history of that conflict and you look at the little different events that occurred, it makes sense that both sides wanted to kill each other.
yeah,
Like, it just so, yeah,
yeah,
given the
and
context, it's not a surprise at all that Andrew Jackson did not put natives on the
yeah,
same level as his white brethren.
yeah, which I'm sure we'll get into it
Still a
later
flaw,
on.
still wrong, but,
Yeah, but would
he
you
saw
agree
some
though
bad
that
stuff.
he probably genuinely thought he was doing what was best for them? Like, as far as, like, he
Yeah,
genuinely thought, like, the only 2 options are we kill them all or we move
yeah,
them somewhere else. So it's like, "Look, I don't actually wanna kill all you guys." Like, I don't
yeah,
wanna
it's
have to
yeah,
do
it's a
that.
very,
So it's
like,
not like he's like, "Hey, let's just round them all up and exterminate them and do experiments on them." You know what I mean? It's not and I
yeah,
feel like sometimes that's, like, what I don't wanna say just woke, but you know what I mean? I feel like people wanna put someone in a box and be like, "No, Jackson was evil, and he was, like, doing" and I feel like I've seen where that's kind of the characterization of him, and
mhm.
I just wanna make sure that while, yes, he was gonna put America first, like, at that time, it's like, I think he did a pretty good job, to be honest, of, like, playing fair, in a sense, like, I think there's certain things in our 2025
If you're
perspective,
saying
yes,
that he
but
could have murdered him, yeah, he did a good job in the sense that he didn't just kill him, but he did kick off, the Trail of Tears like we just talked about before we started
yeah,
recording. He wasn't responsible for everything that happened, but he did kick that off. So, I mean, but to your point, yes, he could have a lot of people, especially in, like, Georgia and places like that in the Deep South, wanted to just kill him, and they didn't care what happened to him. And
yeah,
he thought from the perspective of, "Well, we're gonna kill you otherwise." Yes, he did wanna do what was best for them and just get them off the land so there wasn't conflict between white Americans. But, yeah, I mean, it's still horrible. It's just not as horrible as it could have
yeah,
been. It's definitely not, like you said, it's definitely not Hitler and Stalin levels where he just wanted
yeah,
to exterminate a people group, which a lot of white Americans did feel that way about Native
yeah.
Americans.
But I don't think he
So
was one
yeah,
of them. I guess is my only
no,
point is, yeah, I guess there are definitely things he could have done better, but it's not some motivation of a
yeah,
genocide of like,
it
"Oh, I
was
just
just
wanna wipe out all natives." Like, it was
yeah,
not that. It's like you said,
but it
to
did come from a
secure
very, like, to actually use the term properly, it did come from a very racist, like, white people are on top, and as long as we get them figured out and everybody stays out of our way, like, we'll be good. So that's an actual
yeah.
proper use of that term, is when someone
But it's
does
also,
something like
to just continue to play devil's advocate, it's like these native groups were not unified, but they were acting like they were unified, and then they're also gonna try and sign treaties with the Brits or the French, and it's like again, there's so many things you could point to. Again, could it have been done better?
yeah,
100%. But
for
there was
sure.
not. It's not like there was zero reason for this to happen. You know what I mean? It's like you
Yeah,
do have to be
definitely.
concerned with American security, um, and then it's just tough because I mean they were here first, so then that's like always the starting argument. But it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I mean whatever. But
But the
anyway,
the thing I like the thing that you have to acknowledge with that is after you get past the Revolutionary War itself, you can't really use that excuse against other presidents. Again, not to make an excuse for Jackson because he did do awful things. I mean, we just talked about they slaughtered, an entire people and only one kid was left. So they did awful things, but Jackson was not the one who colonized the Americas.
oh
So
yeah,
once people are just born in South Carolina and end up being in a place of power, they can't help the fact that they are colonizers. That's where they were born,
Yeah.
and they live there, and their families live there, and that's where they do business. And so it's, that becomes a moot point very shortly after. And I said the revolution, I didn't mean that. The settlement, the original settlement of America, which is a
Yeah.
century removed by the time you get to the revolution, which is when Jackson's just a kid. So yeah, to your point, yes, that is true. They colonized, the natives were there first, but you got to blame the original people who colonized for that. What are,
Yeah.
people that are,
Which
again,
and
people
that's
that are white and are born in America, they're, what are they going to do? Move
yeah.
to England? They don't have a way of getting there.
Yeah.
So anyway, not to go, we're not even talking about like what the book actually covers yet. So I think, obviously the Battle of New Orleans was huge. The book doesn't cover that in detail, but that's
That's
what
where he becomes famous.
solidified Jackson's fame. The crazy thing about that is the war had been over for like 3 weeks when that battle occurred, or maybe not that long. I know it was a matter of a couple weeks, but the communication back then just took forever. So it's an epic battle, and Jackson stood his ground, but it turned out no one had to die. So it's just one of those. But at the time, I think Meacham mentions it briefly. But at the time, like, because people understood communication, I don't think that mattered to people in America.
Yeah.
Like, even though they found out that happened post-war, they're like, "Well, he had no way of knowing. Like, he was just doing his duty, so
Yeah. I
hoorah."
mean,
So
honestly,
it's just kinda
yeah,
wild in the context of the times.
I don't feel bad for the Brits at all. So, and
I
I'm
mean,
sure they
no.
did. I'm
I
sure
don't
those people really didn't feel bad for the Brits.
No,
You know what I
no.
mean?
They're like,
They're
"Oh, it
like,
happened
yeah,
after the war? Bet. That's even
that's
better."
fine.
They
Yeah.
probably loved that.
Bro, and the numbers
Um,
to that was crazy. I mean, I don't even want to get. I remember it was like hundreds killed to like I don't even like tens killed on the American side. Like
yeah,
it
it
was like one of
was
those where it was like a
yeah, they called it Jackson's Agincourt, or Agincourt, however you say it, which we read that
yeah,
book about Henry V, not, pretty recently here. And that's Henry's huge battle that made him
that
famous,
was
where
kind of a cool point.
the numbers were just so skewed.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what shoots him to fame. And then we kind of get to what the book really covers. And I mean, we are 36 minutes into this, and we are now going to get into
Let's
more of
do
the
it.
details of what's covered. So I mean, you want to take it from here, brother? I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's election time.
So we're election time. Like Jesse said, a lot of different factors that bring Jackson to fame. New Orleans, he has, some success in Florida when John Quincy Adams is president, but he ends up being able to kind of harness that fame in a way. And again, from kind of Nashville as a shooting off point, he gets married to a significant family. There is some trouble that rises up from that because I guess his wife was still married, and I guess was it confirmed whether she was still married in the like not actually technically divorced when they got married, or it made
I
it
think
sound
it's
like they
not
were still
a
married, but
Yeah, I
they were
think
trying to
it's
act like
one of
they
those
weren't.
things where it's like, oh, I guess we don't know 100%, but we're like 97% sure that she was
Yeah,
still married when they got
they go
together.
run off. But it does seem though that it's not going to be. I know it tries to get compared to Margaret Eaton, but it doesn't give the same vibe. At least Meacham doesn't. They seem to be truly in love. But Rachel's family was well off in Nashville. I think that combined with his, I don't know if you kind of read it this way, but her kind of political significance with her family combined with his likability, it seemed like everyone that knew him
Yeah.
like ended up loving him. Even the people that like were his enemies, whenever they'd meet him, they'd apparently he was way different than what they thought.
I'd be like,
But
dude, he's
that
shit.
combined with his fame, kind of escalates him as the common man. And so even when teaching this, um, it's not very much material that like I taught on this. It's kind of like a paragraph or two, and that's kind of the main thing that's characterizes that Jackson is the common man's president. So this he ends up running for president before, and he loses. It
Yeah.
goes to the House. So it's essentially tied, and it goes to the House, and then I think it's Henry Clay, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is the deciding vote, and it goes to John Quincy Adams. So he's already still kind of hurt with that, and so going into 1928 or 1828, sorry, um, he wants to win outright, and that kind of fuels him too because he feels like he was already cheated from a presidency when the majority of the nation wanted him. And so again, it just
Yeah.
reaffirmed what he believed about the American government that basically power was held by like an old aristocracy. People like John Quincy Adams, whose father was also a president, and
Right.
Jefferson, this elitism class of highly intellectual people. Um,
And what
so
confirmed that for him was, you know, because I read about this in the James Traub book about John Quincy Adams. When he won the presidency, it came to that essential tie, and then it appeared to Jackson and the enemies of John Quincy Adams that Henry Clay and JQA came to an unhonorable agreement. By essentially what they were saying in layman's terms was,
Henry
oh,
Clay wanted
Henry
his
Clay
castle.
said he'd throw his Henry Clay said he'd throw his support if he got a sweet position.
Yeah,
Now Meacham actually makes, I felt like, kind of made an argument that that wasn't really a good, um, that he didn't feel
characterization.
like that was true because he felt like Henry Clay would have gotten that position either way, most likely. Which I thought that was interesting because I felt like Traub, even though he clearly likes John Quincy Adams, the author of that biography, I feel like he kind of admitted that it seemed like this was the one time John Quincy Adams like played politics and did something kind of less than
Yeah,
honorable. So to give you context, yeah, Jackson felt like something unhonorable was done, and that specifically like you said, the American people were robbed of what they actually
yeah,
wanted. Because I believe he did win the popular vote.
I think he did too. Yeah,
I could be wrong on
um,
that, but either way, that's what Jackson felt like was going on.
e- exactly. And so he ends up winning though in 1828,
Hmm.
and one of the things though that does impact him, which will lead to like the next thing we talk about though, is that whole gossip train of people trying to characterize Jackson as, because I don't think he went to college. I think he maybe went to, did he go to West Point? Am I
I
making
don't
that
think he
up?
went
No,
to.
I don't think he did
No,
either.
I don't think so.
So he wasn't like a learned man like all these others were. So I think the characterization of him being a backwoods guy, it only fit for them to be like, oh, well, he married this lady who is already married to someone else. Like that's such a
Right.
class, and he, him and Rachel had a great relationship. So she had already just died, like you mentioned before. Um, so, or well, no, she hadn't died yet, I don't think, but
Yeah,
like
she
before
died
he'd
when he
won,
was
she died.
president elect.
Okay, true.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I mean, that was a personal shot at, and like we kind of talked about before, he doesn't have a ton of family. So the family he does have, he's very protective of, and so he took that very personally, and that ends up kind of bleeding into the next topic. But we do see kind of the first true switch from like who does this elect group want to be president to who does everyone else. Like it kind of, Meacham presents it as the first time like campaigning's really kind of real, like campaigning to like you and I is real instead
Right.
of just campaigning within. All right, well, who do we? Who's the Democrats saying that we should vote for? It's like no, who is like who's actually talking to the people and saying like, hey, come vote for me, which is kind of a cool way to think about it. At least to me, it's realizing that
Yeah.
there is a
Well,
switch in government styles.
yeah, and I think Jackson thought it was cool too because he takes with him the rest of the next 8 years because he has 2 full terms. He considers himself the man of the people, and he considers the presidency being the sole elected position by the people at the federal level, and therefore it should enact the will of the people. So he takes that with him
Exactly.
into all of his decisions as president, once he wins. And I think, kind of the last thing about his election that's funny, and you and I talked about it when we were
Yeah,
first
that's
reading the
interesting.
book, is there's always been this idea that Jackson had a party on the White House lawn, like some redneck, when he won, or when he was inaugurated, when he first became president. And come to find out, and I read about this in John Quincy Adams' biography, but I just didn't pick up that like what exactly had happened. But John Quincy Adams was kind of pissed off. Like he was a little
Yeah.
butthurt that he did not win the presidency, and they didn't speak really, and they didn't see each other the day of the inauguration. And John Quincy Adams and his administration left no plans for a transition, so like no one was there to, for one, set things up for the people that were supposed to be there, but two,
Yeah.
just to keep a bunch of random people out of the White House and off the premises. So there were like hundreds of people just drinking, like passing out, eating,
It sounds
partying
like the
on the White House
insurrection.
lawn.
It sounds very similar to the insurrection, to be honest, the
Yeah,
vibes.
kinda does.
But, like, it's a party version of that where it's like, wait, it goes so far, it's like, well, what's happening, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it was
so
wild. So yeah, he gets inaugurated.
he does.
Um,
So just to go over his cabinet real quick, though, because to me the cabinet was interesting. I just kind of put it back in this note here, but um, there ends up being a lot of controversy, which leads to the Petticoat Affair, which I'm sure we'll kind of lead into here. But I wanted to just at least outline the cabinet of like actual names. So his vice president, this is again first term, is going to be John C. Calhoun. This ends up being a big deal because Calhoun's from South Carolina. He ends up being the main player for the Nullification Crisis. And honestly, they're not friends. So again, this was, and
mm-mm.
Meacham talks about how they weren't friends like before. I know he was brought on to help him get more of the Southern vote, but I was surprised. I didn't know that that was who his first term vice president was. But
Yeah.
anyway, you could tell they weren't close. It seems like the rest of the people on this list, though, he had a decent relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
So Van Buren, he has a great relationship with. He also, his wife had died. And so he was able to give a lot of attention to Jackson, ends up becoming close with him. Obviously, that ends up playing out well for Van Buren because he ends up becoming president. We got Samuel Ingram as Secretary of Treasury, John Eaton, Secretary of War. This ends up being a big deal because this is where all the controversy that Jesse talked about before comes apart. John Branch, Secretary of Navy, John M. Barron, Attorney General, William T. Berry, General Postmaster. And then, technically not listed in this, but definitely worth mentioning, is Andrew Donaldson, who is a family friend, but ends up being a close, like, confidant of Jackson. So does Emily, his wife, who ends up kind of being because Jackson's not married, or well, because Jackson's wife is dead, he doesn't have, the
A first
first
lady.
lady. And so Emily ends up playing that role. But anyway, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of sets the scene, I guess, of where we're at with Jackson and who he's got in his group. So do you want to hit us with that
Yeah.
that petticoat affair?
So yeah, we kind of already discussed it, but to hit it again, the Petticoat Affair, which involves a lot of Jackson's cabinet.
Ends up
Again,
being a big part of
Washington
this book too.
Society. Yeah, I mean, this is a big part of the book. Washington Society completely ostracized Margaret Eaton, who is the wife of the Secretary of War that you just mentioned, John Eaton. Um, and again, she was a promiscuous lady, so people just didn't like her. Um,
It seemed like
Jackson
she
defended
wasn't
her though.
cool either, though,
Yeah,
right?
she didn't
Like,
seem cool at all. Like it seemed like Jackson missed the mark on this one because I
because he
mean
didn't know her.
Eaton,
Yeah,
yeah, John Eaton was really seemed to be very loyal and was cool, good for Jackson at the time, but Margaret does not seem like I
no,
probably would have shunned her too. I wouldn't have visited
yeah.
her house after she visited mine. Um,
I think it
but
shows the
yeah,
separation though of like male society and female society because Jackson's probably like, no, I'm going to stand by my boy John. They're going to slander his wife like that. He's been loyal to me. I'm going to be loyal to him. But he's not catching the Emily Donaldson, Margaret Eaton interactions, or
right,
Margaret with, I think it's Calhoun's wife, or, like he's not seeing those interactions. So again, it's
right.
probably him just taken for granted, just trying to
And
be there for his
again,
buddy.
it's important to note that during the uh, election campaigning process, his wife was, called nasty things, talked about in the
Yeah.
papers. That was like a tactic. So he had like a personal stake in people he cared about, their wives being talked badly about because he had experienced that. And then his
Yeah.
wife died. So he's very
Yeah.
personally intertwined in this kind of thing. So I think Meacham makes again throughout the book, makes it clear that especially later, Jackson kind of does realize that like I kind of shouldn't die on this hill, the Margaret Eaton hill, because she actually isn't cool.
Yeah.
Um, but essentially what happens is it does lead to a division in Jackson's cabinet. It becomes a huge issue. So yeah, John C. Calhoun is his vice president. His wife doesn't like her. Emily Donaldson is essentially his first lady, and her husband, Andrew Donaldson, is essentially the closest confidant and aide to Jackson
Yeah.
at this time. Neither one of them like her, and that's a major problem because Emily Donaldson is like, again, like essentially the acting first lady, and she's
Yeah.
not getting along with the wife of someone else in the cabinet. So it blows
And
up,
very
and
much so,
essentially,
like, family, like, like, the closest family it
yeah,
seems that Jackson has since his wife is dead. Like, this is his first line of
yeah.
defense, people he trusts.
Yeah, and it kind of exposes what was a potential weakness in Jackson is that he did prefer
Point.
loyalty over
Yeah, that's a good point.
political expertise. He and again that for some may be again another parallel today is that some people see that in Trump that he's more just loyal to people who are
Yeah,
loyal to him,
yeah, I
rather
see that.
than people that maybe not everybody thinks are best for the job. Um, so that's pretty much the essential thing with the Petticoat Affair, and it leads to a division in the cabinet where Van Buren comes to this agreement with Jackson where he says, "Look, I'm gonna distance myself for this so that I can be the carrier of your legacy without this stain." So he resigns the cabinet, and then John Eaton actually does as well because after all kinds of melodrama back and forth, he just can't take it anymore. He's like, "Yo,
Yeah,
like this is terrible," which honestly, I feel for my boy John Eaton. Like that does suck.
he picked the
Especially
wrong
given
one.
that like
That was a
he
tough
did for
call
the
for him,
times,
man.
but it's crazy in modernity to look back and think, "Bro, could you imagine if all of my friends just shunned some girl because she's, like, slept with a bunch of dudes or something?"
Well,
Like,
I think it
it's
is the
just
point though that
wild to
she
think
was.
about.
It's tough because it's like, yeah, who cares what someone's done in the past? But it seems like Emily Donaldson like try like I don't want to say she. It seemed like she tried in the beginning, and then it's like no, like she's tough to be around. So it's like
Yeah,
we're
I mean,
combining
again,
the fact
Margaret
that
Eaton
she's tough
seemed
to
like
be
she
around
sucked.
with the fact that she's a stain on everyone's reputation who like is next to her,
Right.
which that's the blight of the time. But it seems like Margaret just does not do herself any favors, dude, by
No, she doesn't,
just
she
being
definitely
so
doesn't.
disrespectful for no
Like
reason.
later, like, after the Petticoat Affair is really kinda over or close to it, Jackson and Van Buren go to visit the Eatons,
Yeah,
and I think
she's
only Margaret is there, and they have this interaction with her, then they leave, and in old time talk, I'm paraphrasing, Jackson essentially looks at Van Buren and is like, "I don't know what just happened." And
yeah.
it's where Meacham points out that this is where Jackson starts to realize, "I should not be defending this woman just because he's
Yeah.
my friend, like, she actually is not it."
She was
So,
not appreciative of all at all when she had been, I guess, before because she knew Jackson was going to bat for them. But yeah,
yeah. And so those 2 resign, and then it actually results in Jackson just dismissing the rest of his cabinet, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know if I fully understand, why he did that. It seemed like maybe it was just to kinda just expunge all the bad vibes and start from scratch. That's really all I could kinda gather from it. But yeah,
well, they
that's
were
the
trying to, I
petticoat.
think, make it to where it wasn't about her, but it was. But they're trying to make it to
Yeah.
where, like, hey,
Trying to
we're
make it
not
seem
doing
like
this for that. Because I think
yeah.
Van Buren was one of the few people that supported the Eatons because his wife was dead. So he had no care about how she was. And so Van Buren's like, hey, I'm going to remove myself. So then Eaton feels like he can remove himself without it being like, oh, well, we're just dismissing
Right.
Eaton because his wife is a
Right.
problem. And so, but then obviously
Yeah.
people still point to that. But then also, I mean, Calhoun is a part of the cabinet as well. It's like, I mean, we need to get him out of here anyway. Like, I mean, why
Yeah.
is he
He
a
was
part of it?
trash.
But I do believe this is the point where um I think Jackson feels pretty tough about it because there ends up being a national view of like, oh, well, what did Jackson do wrong? And I think he
Like, as
kind of
far
takes
as
that
the
a little
all the
personal.
cabinet being dissolved?
Yeah, like what's going on?
Yeah.
Like that's a bad sign, for
Yeah,
so
which
many
makes
people.
sense though. Like Meacham points out, like this was a big risk because if you're
Yeah,
not involved in the day to day of DC, you have no way of knowing the context, and all you know is that the entire cabinet is now gone.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
so yeah, it does seem crazy. Like if that happened in today's times, can you imagine, bro? Like we
yeah,
find out tonight Trump dismissed his entire cabinet. I mean, there would be political upheaval like
for
all
sure.
over,
He
everything.
he does seem to point out though that he replaces them with people that maybe were more competent though. Like
Yeah, I
he
mean
says that it's
he
a
makes good
stronger,
on
more
it for
unified
sure.
team with because the Livingston guy seems like he's pretty solid, and so is the Tanny guy. I think McLean maybe is the one who ends up being the support of the bank. I can't remember, but anyway, for the most
Yeah.
part, they still kind of power through. And then I guess it wasn't as bad though because he does get reelected. So, but
Yeah, I mean, he ends up being fine, but yeah, so that was like a 2-year affair that just had a lot of impacts that we tried to just kinda describe. I think the biggest one is just that it does lead to Van Buren being, uh, the president because he is kinda not associated with that anymore, and he ends up kind
Yeah.
of carrying Jackson's legacy. He does become Jackson's second vice president. So that's the Petticoat Affair. Again, it's all throughout the book, but we're probably not going to talk about it too much more unless it comes up organically. But I think the biggest things to take from it is that Jackson loyally and sometimes to a fault defended the people that he loved,
Yeah.
which is a trait that we all adore in people. You know, he again sometimes even um, what's the word? Like it's honorable to see someone who will stand by a
Yeah.
person even when that person is wrong, just because they love that person. So
I mean, he's
it's a
the
cool thing to
historical
see
Vin
in the
Diesel.
character of Jackson. He's Vin Diesel, bro. It's all about
Family.
family. So to get into the really big stuff throughout his presidency, I had this note and a cool quote to go with it. So patronage, the bank, nullification, Indian removal, clerical influence in politics, respect abroad. These were the questions that would define Jackson's White House years. And then a quote states, it was Jackson and his interpretation of the will of the people versus those congressmen, senators, bank presidents, nullifiers, judges, federal officials, religious activists, and Indians who differ from him. So that kind of just breaks down what we're about to discuss and what defines all of Jackson's presidency. So I thought that was a pretty potent quote from the book. The first bit was from the book, the second was an actual quote from the Times. Um, so yeah, I mean, next up is the nullification crisis. You want to break that bad boy down for us?
Yeah. So this one, honestly, when I think about what I had to teach, it's this and the Indian Removal Act, or the things that I
Yeah,
knew about coming into this book.
right.
Um, and so anyway, like, I wasn't shocked that it was a big key. Again, what I was more shocked at, I guess maybe I knew, but I just didn't realize it. But John C. Calhoun being so, they weren't close, but him being the vice president, which I guess doesn't necessarily mean what it means today, where, like,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's still, I mean, Trump and Pence weren't close at the end either. So, I mean, I guess it can still happen anyway,
But
but
presidential candidates pick their own now, whereas
yeah,
at this time, at least, it was picked by the party and
yeah,
at a convention,
yeah,
or something along those lines.
exactly. So, but anyway, the way this is going to work is South Carolina is, there are some tariffs that are being enforced, federal tariffs on the state of South Carolina about stuff that's coming in. Again, this is to help pay for, I think, still war efforts from the Revolutionary War. And
And
South
then the
Carolina wanted
tariff is
to,
on all the states.
yeah, yeah. And so, but I guess South Carolina was acting like it was affecting them more, which I think it was, just
Yeah.
because their industry was more based on the things that were being taxed.
Mhm.
So it was
Yeah.
not
It was a
as
tariff that hurt the
proportional.
South more, and it from their perspective, at
Yeah.
least, and it seems like they were probably right, a tariff that hurt the South a little more and helped the North a little bit
Yes.
more, because all the Southern states were feeling it. Georgia and, all these
Mhm.
other states were not happy about the tariff, but sorry, keep going.
No, no, yeah, no, exactly. So I mean, their point is basically like, hey, we're just gonna say we're not following this law. Like, as South Carolina, like, we'll follow these other laws that the federal government's gonna have, but not this one. So I mean, that's, I guess, the term nullifying it, because they're gonna say that that law was unconstitutional. And so, it's the back and forth of like, no, but you have to. And it's like, well, then kind of almost make me kind of thing. Or like, hey, well, then we'll just leave. Like, if we'll leave the union and secede. And that was where the whole, like, I mean, Jackson was so adamant about national identity and keeping America whole. And so this was like a very personal battle for him. Whereas I do wonder if someone else was in his spot during this time, they may have just folded and been like, you know what, y'all do your thing. We're going to do our thing up here. Um, but then in the end, it's like, it is true, like some of the points that he makes of like, yeah, maybe you, Calhoun, feel this, but does everyone in South Carolina feel this way? Because this will end up being the same thing all over again of like, well, what if there's a group of people that are in power that want something, but the rest of the people don't? Are you going to secede again within South Carolina and have, it's like that cycle,
Right,
the idea of like just giving in to regional things if the nationwide we don't agree on it, like,
right. It's all about
I,
precedent, and
yeah,
Jackson understood that.
and I get the frustration for South Carolina too, but like, that's the beauty of the United States, of like us as a unit. So there's going to be benefits that you get as a unit, but then there's also going to be sometimes where maybe something affects you more negatively. Um, and so anyway, certain things happen. Jackson's going to threaten like, hey, we'll like you were saying that you thought like actually happened, but like he was threatening like, hey, well, I'll go down there and I'll solve this. Like he
Yeah.
was kind of like, hey,
Yeah.
get me
I mean,
at
he
this.
threatened to send troops, which is where my
Exactly.
misconception of the crisis came from, but he did threaten that.
Yeah. And so the force bill comes into act. This is something that does pass through Congress, which I thought this was interesting. This is kind of one of the many times that Meacham points to where people are like, hey, Jackson's doing too much. But it was funny, like as a president, like he's overstepping his powers because the force bill basically gives Jackson military power to crush any resistance within the United States. So it allows him to send troops um, to deal with like internal issues, not just external issues. But the thing is, I guess in the Constitution, he already had that right. And so he was kind of playing politics here too of like, hey, I'm going to propose this to Congress. Then if Congress says no, like, I mean, Meacham was kind of forecasting what he could have done if Congress
Right.
did not approve that. But I think this is one of those times where, like you were saying, that he's characterized as someone who oversteps his power. But Meacham kind of points out, hey, but he wasn't, because he could have just said, no, I don't have to do this. Like, I can
Right.
just do this anyway. So this is where Henry Clay, I mean, he's already kind of a big part of this anyway, with how Jackson loses the first election to John Quincy Adams. But Henry Clay, especially when I was teaching U.S. history, he's the great compromiser. And so this is one of his first compromises is, which really doesn't seem like a great deal for South Carolina, honestly. It seems more of like an appeasement thing of like, hey, we're recognizing that this is not easy for you. Whereas maybe Jackson wasn't doing that. And so it was more of like an in name than anything. I mean, he cuts down some of the tariffs, but it's not even like what I think South Carolina proposes a tariff cut, and then he like doesn't even get close to meeting it, but it's still some
Yeah.
sort of a cut.
And I
And
think
so,
it's important to mention that Meacham says Jackson was actually, I didn't, it's a cool thing to know. He was actually the one who first recommended reforming the tariff. So it wasn't like Jackson was coming from a stance of
yeah,
you're going to pay this tariff no matter what and you're going to freaking like it. I don't care what you think. He was willing to concede that the tariff was a little tough on southern states because
yeah,
again, what I thought was cool about this too that I made a note of is he was having to ride a fine line of appeasing South Carolina to avoid their issue, but also like he was also trying not to further anger the other southern states because at the time,
yeah.
in hindsight, we know that no other states ended up threatening nullification. They stood by the union.
Yeah.
They didn't want to disband. But Jackson was worried if I push too hard on them, what if
He's
Georgia
not getting
decides to
reelected.
join them? Well, he's not
Or
getting
yeah,
reelected, and it might incite further, talks
yeah.
of disunion because this South Carolina was using certain not the whole state, not everybody, but there were people in South Carolina using the word secession and questioning if
Oh
they
yeah,
might have to secede.
100%. This ends up
Which,
being what
funnily
I
enough, they
think
end up being the ones to first secede in the Civil War. So,
South Carolina is a problem for sure.
problem.
Um, but something that I saw for the first time that I didn't necessarily realize, which I think Jackson needs credit for, is the fact that yeah, he owned slaves. And yeah, he maybe didn't treat natives as well as someone in 2025 looking back would. But I don't know. Like, I think it does deserve mentioning the fact that he saw it so important to preserve the Union. And again, while he didn't like give rights to everybody in America, he still wanted to fight for the common man. And yeah, his version of the common man is a lot different than what we see the common man is today. But the thing is he was still taking a step forward. He wasn't going backwards.
Right.
He was still taking a step forward in the right direction. And then he could have easily been like, you know what? Yeah, y'all do your own thing. But instead, he's like, no, we got to, as a family, figure this out. Because again, he's viewing America as a family. Yeah, it's not going to be an easy decision, but we got to figure it out. And that leads to, I mean, yeah, South Carolina does end up seceding, but it puts America in, I think, a stronger place to where, they're able to weather the storm of the Civil War and then come back in a better spot, as far as like the Emancipation Proclamation going through, you know, slavery being expelled, blacks getting rights in America. I mean, I know it takes a long time for that to really see any fruition, but I just don't think a lot of people realize, because I didn't, like Jackson's impact in that, because it's like, well, he owned slaves. And it's like, yeah, I know he did, but he didn't care about just protecting state rights, which like everyone who is, who grew up in the South like 30, 40 years ago, they were taught that the Civil War was over state rights. Well, Jackson
Hmm.
was against that. Not like against states having rights, but he was against like having state rights over federal like
Right.
law. And that ends up being the rationale that expels slavery. So again, even though he had slaves, he fought for the right that ends up ending slavery, which is so important. Like because he could have easily just been like, no, like this isn't worth it. This is too hard of a fight now. And I just genuinely think America would be in a different spot because I just don't think they could
Yeah.
have weathered the storm of secession back then. Because you're right, if the momentum ball would have happened and Georgia secedes, then Alabama, then like Tennessee, or I mean Virginia, I mean who knows like where they'd be at? Because I mean it's another 35 years, which I mean that's significant, especially back then before the Civil War really gets going, or 30 years, I guess. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's super important, and I do agree that and it makes sense why this is one of the defining moments for Jackson, because it is all about union and the idea,
yeah,
because this is not the first time that there's ever been talk of a state, you know, people in that state talking about not being part of the union, but it's the first time that it's really looked at a national level as a possibility. And so it's just a defining moment for union above all, which is the defining characteristic of the Civil War,
America. Oh well, yeah.
and of America.
Like what makes America different than any other country, you
Yeah.
know?
So it's a very important moment. And this is definitely one of those moments where, probably the first moment where it felt like Jackson really expanded the powers of the presidency throughout the Nullification Crisis,
Yeah.
which is a big theme in the presidency of Jackson. So yeah, that's nullification for you.
Nullification. What a word.
Which I didn't I vaguely understood what that was, but actually having the context of what was going on is very interesting, and cool to know. So, I mean, anything else on the nullification crisis?
No,
I
I
mean,
think that's
Jackson
good,
held
man.
it down.
He
Um,
did. I think it was the correct way of expelling his powers. I don't think it was an overstep. I think it would be easy to look at it and be like, "Oh, that's an overstep," but I actually think it was. I think it was needed, and it was the right place, right time for that.
yeah, agreed. Okay, so that takes us to one of the other really big defining factors of Jackson's presidency, and that's the war with the United States Bank. The national bank, if you will. So essentially, Jackson referred to I wrote down somewhere in my notes, but I remember it. He referred to the bank and the leaders of the bank as the moneyed aristocracy. So contextually, it's important to understand that Jackson saw them as the elite. And it's important to also remember that he sees himself as the representative and the will of the common man, of the people. So Jackson's whole aversion to the national bank is really conceptual and idealistic. It's because to jump to the end, this wasn't really great for the American economy. But from Jackson's perspective, anybody that had that kind of power, what he saw as undue elite power over the people, specifically over their money,
Yeah.
it didn't work for him. It was anathema to who he was, which is
What a
which
word.
results in this war with the bank. So essentially, he vetoes the recharter of the bank, and then after that, he starts pulling federal funds from the bank and putting them elsewhere. Which, vetoing the recharter puts question marks on the future of the bank. Pulling the federal funds actually takes away the ability of the bank to do business because they
To
don't have
impact.
anything to loan on or whatever it may be.
They
Um,
can't buy
but
people out either. They can't.
right, yep, yep.
Which that
They
was one of
can't
the
buy
main points that I
loyalty.
remember too. Of I think it was someone in his cabinet was riding in a carriage, like in a whatever with another senator, and he was like asking this guy to read his speech about like how negative the bank was, and it was against the bank. And then that guy ended up supporting the bank, and then he found out that he got a loan of like 20,000. He got some sort of loan, and that was like another like, all right. Anyway, so
Yeah, yeah. So
the veto
again,
too. Sorry that was something that I forget, and
yeah.
it's
So
not
that I
necessarily
was
in our
gonna say
notes. Yeah, go.
that's a huge part of this conflict is he
Yeah,
vet. So the first six presidents before Jackson had a total of 9
yeah, that
vetoes
was
combined.
crazy.
Jackson had 12 total. which
Yeah.
now it sounds like, I mean, these presidents out here doing hundreds a day, it feels like,
Yeah.
executive orders and vetoes and everything else. But back then, for one single two-term president to have 12 vetoes, you have to remember that coming from the Revolution and George Washington separating from the King of England, anything that smacked of monarchical power was anathema to the American people and to the Constitution, really. So, where was I going with that? I'm so lost now. Oh my
No,
god.
I mean, I the veto, the
Oh, the
way I
veto.
saw it,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, the way I saw it was that he, again, saw himself as the voice of the people. So
Yeah.
whereas I guess the previous president saw, at least Meacham kinda characterized it, and you correct me if I got this wrong, but that, like, "Hey, if Congress decides this, then these people are smart, and if they've come to this conclusion, then it probably is what's
Yeah.
best." Whereas Meacham's like, "Well, the people didn't get to decide this. This is like an elect group, that are deciding this
Right.
outside of." But anyway.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting towards with the monarchical thing is the reason him vetoing so much was seen as shocking to some people at the time is because a veto is bypassing the decision of Congress.
Yeah.
Um, and the people at that time that there were two schools of thought. You either thought that the Congress was the central force of federal power or the
Yeah.
presidency. And the presidency, a one-man job, again, anything that smacked of a king or seemed like you were giving more executive power to just one person, to a lot of people at the time, was a dangerous thing, and Andrew Jackson was referred to by his enemies as King Andrew the First because of this,
Yeah.
um, at this time. So,
Which a
again, the
veto
main
can
thing
still
to
be
take.
overridden. It's just
Yeah,
now you need 2/3 instead of
exactly.
just, I think it's what, just over 50%
Yeah, I can't
to
remember the exact number,
for it
but
to
they have
even
to
get
have
to that
more.
point where he can veto it. But then once he vetoes it, it has to have 2/3, which, I mean, it's not like he
It
has
doesn't
all
seem
power
like a
to just
bad
shut
thing.
anything down.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it's like, oh, well, then everyone, we really got to figure out if this is what everyone agrees with. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound bad that you're forcing a confirmation that a pretty big majority wants this
Yeah.
done. If it's something that's that important, which again, looking back at it now, this was not good for the economy. But when you look at Jackson as a person, it completely makes sense why he did it. And again, you can almost see, the truth in his desire, in his aim.
Yeah.
And maybe again, I don't know if Meacham necessarily makes this point, but some of it might have been on Jackson's part a lack of full understanding of how the bank worked, because Meacham makes a point that some of the fears Jackson had weren't really realistic, probably could not have come to fruition at this time in,
Yeah.
in America. But it just kind of shows that Jackson has this populist idealism as far as the presidency is concerned. And again, it very much expands the presidential power. Um, and just basically showing that he can defy Congress and do what he wants.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big defining moment for Jackson. Again, it expands the power of the presidency, which is kind of the main thing of Andrew Jackson. So that's a big note as
Changes
far as
America
that's
forever
concerned.
too. That'd be huge if we had a national bank still. We'd be definitely way more like a lot of European countries.
Yeah, it has far-reaching impacts throughout history for sure. So yeah, that's the bank issue,
The
the national
bank.
bank. So then we get on to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Tell us
Hmm.
about that, brother. What you think about
Yeah,
that old removal?
that old removal, man. Um, so again, this is one of the other things where it's like I associate, Andrew Jackson bad with Native Americans. That's like the connection in my mind, which I know we've kind of brought up already before, but he pushes this through, but it doesn't get enacted until, or like the Cherokees don't start walking, and a lot of these people don't start moving until he's already gone, and so it's more Van Buren. But obviously, he's the one who proposes it, pushes for it, and so he definitely is the main guy to blame here. Um, but he's going to push for forced relocation of Native American tribes. This is going to lead to the Trail of Tears, which, especially being us from Georgia, like that's something that you grow up like knowing about.
You hear a lot about that. Yeah.
Exactly. So, which thousands of people die. It's through the winter. It's through the cold. He even references some people
Horrible
talking about,
tragedy.
yeah, about how it was like more scarring than like a lot of the Civil War scenes. Like some people
Mhm.
that were younger that like were a part of both.
Yeah.
Um, And so, there's a lot of controversy on if it could have been done better. I know a lot of the controversy too is around things that it's like it doesn't make it okay, but it's like it wasn't just straight up he took land. I mean, I know he sends people down there to sign deals essentially, and it's a minority group that signs the deal, and so the majority group's like, we didn't do that, but then they're like, oh, well, I thought you were the representatives of the Cherokee Nation. And so it's like a lot of little things keep happening like that, which I'm sure some of them maybe the government knew and they're using it as like a
For sure,
convenient thing
yeah.
to point to. So it's
Yeah.
tough to tell like the nuance of, at least for
And
me,
America also didn't honor a lot of their
true,
agreements that they did go into. So
true,
it's just when I read that Sherman and Geronimo book, this issue is so complicated because
yeah,
again, I think it's really important to note that the people alive in this era, and then especially in Sherman's era, you know, pre and post Civil War, they weren't the ones that created this mess. They just
no,
had to deal with it. So they were given all you're given is the fact that, okay, these settlers were all just slaughtered. A bunch of kids were nailed to trees. And then you hear the next one. These white settlers murdered an entire tribe at
yeah,
night, killed all their kids, and lit them on fire. It's just tragedy and atrocity
lawsuits,
after tragedy and atrocity. It's terrible. But someone like Jackson, again, to go back to kind of what we talked about earlier, he's not given many that's the situation he's giving. He cannot
yeah,
stop the divide and the hatred between two different groups of people that are killing each other, because now
yeah.
it's become a Hatfields and McCoys thing where we've got to get you back for what you took from us. You killed my son, I'm going to kill yours, so on and so forth,
And it
whatever
was
it
tough
may
to
be.
distinguish too on who was, because there were people that were like, "Yeah, we'll assimilate," and there are people that assimilate, and then there's people that are like, "No, we want to stand on our, you know, our cultural pride and identity." And so it's like tough, I think, too. There's so many nuances, and then there's so many tribes that were like, "Yeah, we'll do that. We'll move over and do whatever." And then there's others that like dig in, and it's easy to like encompass all Native Americans together. But that's also why it was so easy for colonists to come in early on and kind of wipe the floor with a lot of these Native Americans, because there wasn't unity. There wasn't some big, especially in
Yeah.
North America, there wasn't some Aztec empire that had infrastructure. That like isn't their way of life. So,
Yeah.
it's so starkly different from, that doesn't make it wrong or right, but it just is what it is. Like you said, I mean, it's just that's what they were given. And so it's like, what do you
Hmm.
want them to do? I mean, yeah, there's things could have been handled differently, but it's not some easy cookie cutter situation where it's like, well, they clearly should have just done this and everything would have been
Right.
okay. Like
Right. And I
it
think what
wasn't
you
that
just said
easy.
about no, it wasn't. It was so complicated. And I think what you just said about infrastructure is a really important note to understand this entire conflict and piece of our American history is that the problem, like to get to the logistics and again, infrastructure of the problem is white settlers were coming in and trying to build roads and, settlements and have stores and shops and houses and have their farms and fence things off or whatever. And the more they started doing that in these lands where Native Americans were used to tracking, whether it was herds of buffalo or whatever their game was, across huge swaths of lands, especially the further you got out west, and especially more so later in history,
Yeah.
what white settlers were doing was completely interrupting all these cycles that the Native Americans in their culture were used to and had to have to survive. So they weren't able to hunt as much game. They had to move to these different places. And it's just a complete culture clash, is really what happened. And that seems elementary to say, but that's why so much of this conflict is so complicated, because they were living such different lives culturally and societally in how they acted. And, so many of these native tribes were nomadic. They moved
Yeah.
around all the time. So they would be used to coming to this one area at this time of the year. But then when they get there, they haven't been in this place in a year. Now there's white settlers everywhere and
Yeah.
they're taking all the game, or they've disrupted the game and now the game goes somewhere else and we don't know where. Now we can't eat for a
Yeah.
month. So it's just so complicated it's not just we're white, you're brown, let's kill each other. Like
Yeah.
it was complicated because it disrupted two totally different cultures. Again, because of colonialism, which is a bad thing. We all know that leads to terrible things. But it's so much more complicated than just that.
Yeah.
Um,
It still is a stain, obviously. It needs to be talked about with Jackson, but I think to it there needs to
yeah,
be like a fair assessment of, yeah, he could have definitely done things better. Like I'm not saying he did this to
Yeah.
a perfect T, but he did not. It could have been worse. And I know that sounds bad, being like, well, he could have been worse. But like, no, he really, I think, did try in his own way, which was flawed, to do things in the least, like he could have done it in a way where it was solely the best for America and whatever. I think he did do things that made it way more complicated for America, and he didn't have to do that, but because he didn't want to just massacre everyone, he's like, I will do
And to be
this, but like I
fair,
don't want to.
yeah, and to be fair, you're saying that in the context of his presidency. Now,
Yes.
pre-presidency, he did massacre some natives for
Oh yeah,
sure.
for sure.
He was a savage. But yeah, as president, as the man in the arena that had the ability to make the decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of people, it does seem like, given the cards he was given, he did in a flawed way, like you said, and maybe didn't go the whole nine, but he did try to, at the very least, prevent bloodshed. It
Yeah.
seemed. Again,
And I
when he was before he was president, he liked
no.
bloodshed, but
Yeah. I do
um,
think though that a part of this that I don't know, I think we've mentioned a little bit, but that I think is important enough to mention is that a lot of these Native American tribes were talking to other European powers that were, I mean, we're
oh, for sure,
trading with
yeah,
other people, but it's not like,
and that
there
goes all the
was,
way back to the revolution.
yeah, so there was potential threat of, it being a loophole for an enemy, a greater enemy to come in. And so, I mean, that I think was a real fear for Jackson.
Mhm.
That's why he wanted Texas later on, that we'll talk about. That's why he wanted Florida. That's why he wants these certain areas, because it's like, hey, we need to lock it up. We can't have any
Yeah, he
weaknesses.
wanted to lock the land down. Yeah,
Yeah.
and a lot of presidents dealt with that, and that was always their concern, is not only could these other countries find a way to own this land, but if they don't go that far, they can make treaties with the natives of these land, and we're gonna have to continually fight them, and we might be
Yeah.
fighting another, they're always worried about Britain. Like, we
Yeah.
only just recently, like, it wasn't until, like, World War One that we stopped worrying about Britain, I feel
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's just a complicated situation.
It is. That's kind of the last of like the big things that he's known for. I don't know if you want to talk about it. I mean, this part I
Dude,
didn't
yeah.
know.
Yeah, so I knew that there were 2 quote unquote assassination attempts on Andrew Jackson. Now the first one
Yeah.
is really just a physical altercation. Like, the dude doesn't, like, nothing really happens
Yeah.
all that much that I remember. Um but there was a time when he got shot in the arm, right?
That may have been from natives. That was before he was president, because he gets it
Yeah, that was
removed, and
before he
then
was a president. That's
he
right.
had it for like
Right.
a long time.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So the actual assassination attempt that's, like, remembered is a dude tries to shoot Jackson at close range with 2 pistols. Neither one of them discharge a bullet. Now, it was reckoned, I don't know if that was
Was it Jefferson?
a modern estimate, or if it was at the time, but it was reckoned that there was a 125,000 to 1
Yeah,
chance
yeah, yeah.
that both of those guns would either misfire or not discharge a bullet, whatever they did. So this guy fires 2 weapons at Jackson, neither one of them fire. As he's firing, Jackson is running at the dude with his cane to defend himself. He sees a
Yeah,
dude pull 2 pistols on him. All he has is his walking stick, and he's like,
and he's
"Okay."
in his 60s. I mean, this is not a
Yeah,
young
I mean,
Jackson.
he's an old man.
Yeah,
So a cool thing that we noted was that many saw this as a sign of divine protection, which again is a funny little parallel to modern times, because
yeah.
Trump does claim that he believes that God saved him from that assassin's bullet so that he could be president. Now, I don't remember Jackson himself claiming that, but people around him definitely did.
Well, so they
And this
tested the
just
weapons, right? Like afterwards, and they
Yeah, they
worked
tested them
perfectly
later, they
fine.
both fired. Yeah, they both worked fine
They
when
weren't
they
messed
tested
up.
them later. So,
They were saying it was
what they
someone.
think happened
Yeah, you go. Yeah.
well, they think now, because they know it was a really muggy day, they think what happened is because all the moisture in the air, it just caused those, like, whatever the
Mhm.
cartridge or whatever it was that caused it to fire to get too damp, and so it just didn't work.
I think they were
Um,
moving somebody though. They were like reburying someone, and so there was like earth that was open. Am I messing that up? I want to say it was maybe
I
like
think he I
Jefferson.
think he added that it was really, I don't know who it was,
So there
but
was
I think
something
he
where it
did
was, yeah,
mention
you're
something
right. It was
about digging
definitely the
up the
moisture,
earth.
but it was like a normal, like it was an abnormal reason to have like more moisture.
I
But
think it was a
anyway,
muggy day, and then,
regardless,
yeah, I think they dug up the earth, and maybe it had rained, and so
or
the soil was
something.
wet.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, essentially, obviously this very much strengthened Jackson's public image. I mean, there was an attempted assassination where a dude fired 2 guns at him at point blank range, and the dude survived. So even though the guns didn't fire bullets, it was still. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously that's going to paint an
people are
image,
taking
especially for
that
people
and
who already loved him. Yeah, they're
running.
like, "Oh, dude, like he ran at him with a cane too." So that's just,
Yeah,
I mean, that's so legendary.
it
But
truly is.
only other thing we didn't mention before we get to like the very end of his presidential his second term is that when he got elected to his second term, it was, of course, that failed candidate that we all know and love, Henry Clay, that he
Yeah,
defeated, and he defeated him by a lot.
yeah,
In that, and when he won his second term. So that's just a funny thing that I feel like you and I have mentioned, and it's a funny note in history that Henry Clay was like this super prominent guy that was definitely flawed, and we disagree with some of the things that he believed in, but definitely would have been a president if he
yeah.
had won. Like he would have been
Him
a
and Aaron
president we
Burr are
remember.
those two guys.
Yeah.
Him, Burr, Alexander Hamilton, which I mean, I know he gets killed by Burr, but those are like
Mhm.
two guys. Those are
Right.
all like super popular American figures that were not presidents.
Yeah. So we get to the end of his second term. There's not too much to discuss. We've kind of hit stuff that happens throughout both of his terms over many years, some of those things we discussed. But end of his presidency, he's obviously very popular. And it's very similar to when John Adams became president after George Washington, where Van Buren himself even says, like, I don't know how I can follow up
Yeah,
Jackson. I don't know how I can fill these shoes because he's just so immensely popular. But his policies did leave some economic turmoil, as we know. Um, and his farewell address reinforced a strong belief in the Union and that type of stuff. And again, defiance of elites and the moneyed aristocracy, if you will. So he left a lasting impression. People loved him. And then I think post presidency, really, his life is mostly chilling and writing letters, which seems to be the post presidency of all these guys. So he's basically just writing letters to his successors, his aspiring successors. He's, as you said earlier, very supportive of the annexation of Texas. So he supports that in a lot of his writings. Um, and then he just kind of goes out. In
yeah.
1845, he dies, reportedly very stoic in death, and also very emotional. If some of the There's always 12 different stories of the last words and the last moments of a president when they die, but it does seem from what we know that he was stoic, but also said some things that made a lot of the people very emotional. Said he'd see him all in heaven and all that good stuff. So
And he said all of them too. He
he did
was
say, yeah, he said all
he
of them,
was
and he had his slaves in the room. That's something that John
he
Meacham
had some
notes.
he had some quotes, yeah, that just make it more confusing, you know,
Yeah,
about
it's like
what he thought
he's,
about black and white people, about like no, like black people will be in heaven too, like in that. But he still owned them, and he didn't free them
and it's
after he
just that
died. So it's like,
classic contradiction of those people at the times. I mean,
yeah,
for people like Jefferson to write the document he did and his history with slavery, and then people like Jackson who owned slaves his entire life, had all the conflicts with Native Americans, but then supposedly before he dies, he looks at all the people in his room, both family members as well as slaves, and supposedly looks them all in the eye and tells them, "I'm going to see. Why are you guys upset? I'm going to see all you guys in heaven. Everyone in the room." He apparently made a point to say everyone
yes,
in this
yeah.
room. Um,
And then
so
even
yeah, I
some of
mean
his
that's
slaves were emotional too. So it's like it doesn't make it right, but it's like clearly it's just so weird. It's just such a thing. It's so hard to like conceptualize in 2025 America because it's like
my
obviously
God.
race relations are tough now, but it's like to think that like he had slaves that then were still sad that he was dying. It's
Yeah,
like
it's
it's
like
just such
what
a
is that? And a lot of
yeah,
it goes to
'cause-
that narrative of, and this is just so racy. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say this, but that whole like, black people being on the plantation and almost a Stockholm syndrome. Like there's definitely an argument for that where that's all they
yeah,
knew and that's the only lifeline they had was living on Andrew Jackson's plantation. Um and I thought there's a funny quote actually from a slave when after Jackson dies, someone asks one of his slaves, "Do you think Do you
He'll get
think
to heaven.
Andrew
Hell
Jackson
yeah.
went to heaven and the slave responded, I don't know who's going to be able to stop him if he wants to? I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing a bit, but that's
Yeah, it was something
essentially
like
what the
that. Yeah.
slave said. And that's kind of an epic quote. Maybe not epic when it's coming from a slave because it's like, oh, did he say that because he got treated badly? I don't know. But it
Yeah.
does seem to exemplify everybody's perception of Jackson. It's like, yo, if he wanted to go to heaven, yeah, he's there because who's going to
Yeah.
stop him? God? The God man? No. um, so yeah, I think that covers a lot of it. I mean, what did we not hit, or what are your kind of overall thoughts of the presidency and everything
Yeah.
we just discussed?
Yeah. We have some themes laid out here, which I know we've already talked about a lot of things in detail, but I guess kind of the main themes, like you kind of said too. I mean, he redefines presidential power. He sees himself as a man of the people. He kind of changes it from being an elite thing to a populist thing. And now people going forward, now they do have to care about the common man. Like they can't just disregard them completely. He's going to veto, and that's going to be something that a lot of people are going to use. Um, he wants new territory, that kind of stuff. Um, I guess that bleeds into him being the father of American populism. He does kind of start um, a new trend, I guess, towards political parties with the kind of the founding of the Democratic Party. Um,
Yeah, yeah, he's
so
considered the first actual capital D Democratic president.
exactly the other theme that we see is the tension between unity and division. So he's going to fight to preserve the union. We're going to see that with the Nullification Crisis, and then again, kind of how we talked about it with the Indian removal policies. He did see that as a way of kind of unifying America, even though that kind of sounds counterintuitive, but because it was kind of securing what he saw as the borders of America, making sure people weren't influenced by outside things. Um, Something we talked about too, that he saw loyalty almost to a fault. Like I know you mentioned that, Jesse, like as like a priority. And so I think that's why a lot of people respected him and admired him, because he was someone who clearly was going to try and keep his word and would fight for the people that, were close to him, even if it hurt him, with Margaret Eaton being a prime example of that, where it would have been way
Right,
easier to just disband that. Um,
right.
but instead he, relates. And then the thing too that you would probably have more to say about this, just because you've read way more about U.S. presidents than I have, like more. But I thought it was kind of cool to see where, in the note here we have Meacham suggests that Jackson set the stage for future strong-willed presidents like Lincoln, Roosevelt, being Theodore, and Franklin. And how a lot of them referred to him. I know there's at least one point that I can remember where Lincoln is um, I think South Carolina's just seceded, and he's kind of in this spot of like trying to figure out what is his next move. And so he pulls all these historical documents from key figures, and one of the ones that he looks at is Jackson's speech about the nullification crisis, like one of the speeches that he has,
Hmm.
and it's strong theme of unity, and he kind of uses that. So that to
Yeah, and
me, I
Lincoln
thought was cool.
actually. What's cool also about that is Lincoln specifically actually refers and uses the precedent Jackson set before Jackson was even president. In New Orleans, uh, before that battle, Jackson suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and Lincoln uses that during his presidency, which is one of the really controversial things from Lincoln's presidency, to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which essentially means you don't have to define your reason for putting someone in jail and arresting
Yeah,
them, because they were in a time of crisis. So, yeah, and then I mean FDR again. I'm pretty sure in the JFK book I'm literally reading now, I'm pretty sure he just referenced something where JFK refers to Jackson. So he was definitely. It's kind of a funny thing when you realize that the thing Jackson's really did was expand the power of the presidency, and so these presidents are like, "Yeah, dude, I
yeah,
like him.
yeah,
Get us more power, bro." Um, but yeah, I mean, he definitely sets up a lot of precedents, which is what so many things in history and even decisions that are made today in government are really all about. Is if we do this, how can someone abuse this in the future? Um, And again, that goes back to the veto and why that was shocking to some people, because it set a precedent that whatever the president believes, if he believes that he was elected because he is the voice and the will of the people, he can deny Congress what they want.
yeah,
And essentially, again, setting precedent and thinking worst case. a lot of people who had problems with this did not have problems with it because they disliked Jackson or even what he was doing. They disliked the precedent he was setting for the power of the presidency, which is really important. Um, and that's a kind of a political thing that good politicians have to ride that fence of, because there's a moment where John C. Calhoun actually defies Jackson, but he actually agrees with Jackson. And I'd have to look
Yeah.
through my notes to find the actual moment, but there is a moment where Jackson is doing something that Calhoun personally agrees with that he would
I
want
think
to see
that's when
happen.
France, we didn't even talk about that. They like kind
Yeah, we
of
didn't talk about France. I think you're
renege.
right.
They renege on paying out that, whatever they had in treaty wise, and that was, a
Right.
big issue. And Jackson kind of makes a hard stand for that, and Calhoun's like, no, we can't be pushed around, I think.
Yeah, and it's essentially it shows that Calhoun is, again, not we don't like Calhoun here. We're not team Calhoun, but again, even if you disagree with him, it's kind of honorable that he's like, I kind of like what you're doing, but I can't agree with it. And his bill ends up failing. He tries to push a bill through Congress in regards to this, and it fails. So it ends up being for naught. But his main goal was we cannot give the presidency this much power. Which we look back at it now, and the presidency is exponentially uh, more powerful than it was back then. But so is really everything. The entire government is,
Yeah,
but it's just cool to see that at the time, things that don't jump off the page necessarily to us were huge, all-consuming issues to them because, I mean, dude, he was only the 7th president. Like, we're on
that's crazy to think
47
about.
now.
Well, it's crazy
That's
to think
crazy.
about how there's a point where Lincoln comes into the story, and dude, you'd probably know better. It's like Lincoln young in his young, like maybe his first appointment. It's I think
Oh,
maybe in
yeah.
Jackson's second term. Is that true
Mhm.
or no?
Mhm.
Which is
Yeah, yeah,
crazy
yeah.
to think because, like you said, he's the seventh president, and then Lincoln is 15, 16,
16. Mhm.
16. To think that it's like it just was weird. I don't know. It's like
No,
you
it
feel like
is
there should
super
be more
weird.
time in between. I know there's some quick deaths as far as people who take power and then they die immediately. I think like John Tyler maybe, but
Right.
still, it's still so early on, and there's some big jumps. But yeah, there's this quote that we have in the notes. It says that Meacham has, for all his vices, and he had many, Jackson refused to accept defeat, either in his own life or in the life of the country. And I feel like that's just like a
I
classic
mean,
thing.
that's Andrew Jackson right there.
As Andrew Jackson.
Um, Dude, another quote that, well, not a quote, but 2 things. One is kind of a quote. Just to quickly go back to Emily Donaldson, she said something in one of her letters that I'm going to try to implement in my life whenever I can. She was responding to a letter where she felt like she was mischaracterized and her actions were mischaracterized. And I only put in quotes, totally unacquainted with the notion. But what she was basically saying is, I am totally unacquainted with the notion of me being whatever she was being accused of. And dude, I'm going to try to fit that in wherever I can. Dude, I'm totally unacquainted with the notion that I did
Yeah.
not do the dishes
Yeah.
or whatever it might be.
We did talk
um,
big picture a lot in this, but the Donaldsons were a pair that I did not know anything about, and
yeah,
now I will forever assign them to Jackson, but like meaning
right.
like they were key for his presidency because he really didn't have anyone else because so many other people in his life had died. He didn't have any other really immediate family members, so they played such a key role. So I know that doesn't show up with it shows up a little bit in the um, deal with Margaret Eaton, but as far as nullification crisis and all that, Andrew Donaldson was key for him. I
Yeah,
mean, key, like a key backbone guy he depended on, who doesn't show up
yeah,
as like a vice president or, and it shows too where he ends up kind of having a steep decline once Jackson's out of the picture, where he kind of I feel like loses himself maybe because I mean his Emily does tragically die at 29 as well, which can only not help
yeah.
him. But anyway,
And that
I
would
mean,
dude, just to hit on that real quick, that was such a sad story.
it
So
was
Emily
sad.
Donaldson was back home and Andrew Donaldson was still in Washington D.C. working for Jackson, and they were going through all kinds of high pressure stuff. So he kept having to push back when he was going to return home. And dude, I mean, she dies
Jackson
like
gets
just a
sick,
matter
dude, and he
of
has to stay a little
days.
longer, dude. And
Yeah,
I think
Jackson
he
gets
misses it
sick
by
and they
two
have to
days.
He misses her death by 2 days, which back then, like nowadays, it seems like, I mean, 2 days, you might as well
Yeah.
we might as well miss it by a year, but back then, 2 days was like 5 minutes. Like, he
Oh
literally
yeah.
was almost there.
Well, and dude, something that is obviously not necessarily important to this, but just you get context with is, I mean, it was dangerous. Like to go from Nashville to DC, like
Mm,
stuff was happening all the time where it's like, all right, someone could die on this journey. And
yeah,
it's like also this journey is going to take a long time. Or someone
yeah,
could get seriously injured. I feel like there's so many times where it's like, oh, and so got almost fatally injured in a cart axle falling off. And, it's like,
yeah,
I
anything,
mean,
yeah,
in fantasy, I know we make fun of it a lot of times where it's like all of a sudden someone's here to here and it's like, wait, how big is this map? How long
right,
does it take for stuff to happen?
right. Are they just teleporting? Yeah.
Getting back to nonfiction, you really feel that, no. Oh, you want to go from Washington to Nashville? Better
Good
plan that 2
luck.
months ahead because
Hope
it's
you
going
see
to
your
take you
wife
about
again, buddy.
50 days to get there.
Yeah. And it's gonna be a horrible ride, super
Oh,
uncomfortable. You're never gonna rest fully. You're gonna be eating like crap,
be
probably.
cold,
Like,
wet. Yeah,
yeah.
you could get robbed.
I mean, everything was so terrible back then. Like, let's just be real. Everything was just terrible.
The little things we take for granted, yeah, are just exposed
It's
for
insane.
sure.
It really is insane to read about. It's almost when you're reading something. I mean, I read a ton of ancient history, and it's like might as well not be real because even when you're reading stuff that's just a couple hundred or not even yet a couple hundred years old, it you cannot fully contextualize and appreciate the setting. You
Yeah,
can't because it's so foreign to
unrelatable.
us.
Yeah.
Like, bro, I can't. I mean, when's the last time? When have I ever been in an enclosed space where the air was not conditioned? You know what I mean? Like, it's just wild to think about. Um,
I mean,
but
we
anyway,
shower
getting off
every
on a
day,
tangent
brush our
there.
teeth
We
every
shout,
day.
yeah.
I mean, hygiene in
Like,
general has come a long way,
I mean, dude,
even in 100 years.
toothpaste, floss, bro,
Floss, toilet
floss,
paper.
toilet paper. Which we might have erred on that one. Now that I'm realizing, like, everybody in Europe just uses a
That is
bidet, and
true.
we're kind of just destroying, our
We're taking,
Netherlands.
we're taking a
Um,
hard turn here at the end of an hour 40.
yeah, this is why we try not to go 2 hours because I start losing my mind, I guess. But
This is the
to get
negative
back
side of
to it,
riffing.
yeah, Jackson, obviously a key figure in American history. This book is great. If you've watched all of this, I mean, you've just got nothing better to do, really.
Mm-mm. And
Um,
hopefully you've learned something. I've learned
I
something.
hope
You've
so.
reinforced what I've read.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we are gonna
yeah,
try to approach these more of where we actually, I guess, talk more about what we really learned and break it down, but we're not historians, so we'll probably get stuff wrong, who knows? But if that's fun for you, if you like just hearing us break down what we learned, don't let us know in the comments because
yeah,
we'll just assume that you love it.
exactly.
Yeah, any other thoughts on
I
old
do want to
Hickory?
clarify one thing, dude, because it bothered me. So I had to look it up while we were off. So the actual tariff that causes the nullification crisis, I did know this, but I just didn't want to just talk out of my ass and like say something that's not true. So it's the tariff of abominations, which again, this is a
Yeah,
tariff that this law is going to raise the import duties on foreign goods to protect northern manufacturers from European competition. So this is going to hurt South Carolina because they don't create goods. Like they have cotton, like they have, what's that word for that? That's not a manufactured good. That's a,
like agriculture.
yeah, I guess that's like a raw good. I feel like I'm looking for a word, but
Yeah,
anyway, you know what I mean. So South Carolina feels targeted, but in the end, they were seeing it as a regional problem, which I guess is real, instead of like, hey, but you need to buy American goods because this is like our thing. So, I mean, that was why it was instilled. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it hurts South Carolina, but it's only because South Carolina is supporting the British economy by buying British
yeah,
goods instead of American goods. So, I mean,
yeah,
yes, it benefits the northern economy and they see it that way, but it's like, I did think it was a tax on goods that were not American, and so I was just wanting to clarify. So it was a
yeah. And
tax on
again,
British
that's
goods, not American
another
goods.
good Yeah, and another good parallel to close out the episode. I mean, tariffs are a big thing today, and
Mhm.
they're not, they're very rarely made to just help Americans straight up. Like,
Yeah.
it's to help the American economy, and sometimes as a as an adjustment to that, it is going to hurt Americans. And that's what happened to South Carolina because tariffs are, I mean, it's very similar to, I think, Jefferson's presidency, where he instilled these tariffs, enforced these tariffs to try to hurt the British economy. And it kind of did, but it hurt us way more. That's, that's the danger of tariffs, but they're typically to try to offset some chasm between American goods and foreign goods that's affecting, production in America. So anyway,
Yep.
anything else, brother?
That's it, dude. This was a fun read, though. Even though it wasn't a 5,
It was.
I I feel like I've filled in massive gaps in my, you know,
Same. And this is kind of, if you've
knowledge.
been hanging out at the channel for a while, this is kind of a bit of an end of a segment because I've read from Washington to Jackson now, and Andrew's read a few of them along the way as well. I think you read Jefferson and Madison, and yeah, and now Jackson. So you get into Van Buren next, and then you have some other people like you have Franklin Polk, which there are some important things that happen in him, but it feels like I've achieved like the big chunk of the early American presidency. So you'll probably see us make a little jump forward to the Civil War era, get some Lincoln and Grant. I've got to get another Grant bio in this year, my favorite president. But yeah, we might dabble in some Franklin Pierce or some James K. Polk. We'll see.
Yeah, I agree. I'm
But
interested in some stuff there.
yeah. But yeah, I think that's it for Old Hickory. Drop a like or whatever, and we'll see you on the next one.
See ya.